Okay, wish a very warm welcome to Nicholas Christakis from Yale University. Very well known for his work on evolution. Very honored to have him with us today. Welcome, Nick. You're going to speak on the evolutionary origins of a good society, which sounds highly needed at the moment. So welcome and thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. Shall I start?
Please do.
I have something like 55 or 60 minutes of remarks. I know this is a sophisticated audience with respect to this topic, but I'm going to try to pitch it at the sort of mid-level, and then we can take questions or talk about it afterwards, however long you want. So again, thank you for having me. I think, for too long, in my view, the scientific community has focused on the dark side of our evolutionary heritage, on our capacity for selfishness and mendacity and tribalism and cruelty and violence. And I think the bright side has been denied the attention it deserves, because our species also evolved to be good, and to manifest wonderful qualities like love and friendship and cooperation and also teaching. And these good qualities, in my judgment, must have outweighed the bad, or we wouldn't live socially in the first place. We'd live in a solitary fashion like many other animals. If every time I came near you, you lied to me or injured me or killed me, I would be better off living atomistically. That means the benefits of a connected life must have outweighed the costs. And I think our species makes a very particular kind of good society for ourselves as a result. Now, we evolved to live not only in groups, but rather in a very particular way, equipped with very particular set of innate capacities. We're not simply like a group of zebras or crocodiles or even ants massing together. And we manifest this social ability very early in life. Many have argued, for instance, that one of the primary functions of play in childhood is simply to prepare us for living together. Children practice making miniature societies of their own. Now, what kind of evidence can we use to ascertain the kind of social order that comes naturally to us and that we are universally, in my view, predisposed to make? If you were a mad scientist, and the kind of experiment you would love to do is to take a group of babies and somehow contrive to have them be isolated on some distant island on their own with no cultural exposure, and somehow manage to have them grow up and then come back and see what kind of social order did they make for themselves. Now, of course, it's impossible to do such an experiment. It would be cruel and unethical, but people have thought about experiments like this and have even called this the forbidden experiment. And in fact, such an experiment has been contemplated or attempted by various monarchs who have typically been interested in what sort of language comes naturally to us. According to Herodotus, for example, the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik I had some children raised without being spoken to in an attempt to determine if we possess some kind of innate language. So the form of these experiments that have allegedly been attempted over the years is to take a couple of babies and give them to a mute shepherd up in the mountains, and then come back years later and see what kind of language did the babies speak. James IV of Scotland also attempted this experiment. His interest was in what language did Adam and Eve speak. And allegedly, in his version of the experiment, when they returned to the babies, they spoke passable Hebrew, was the conclusion of that experiment. But we obviously can't do things like that. So the question is, what might be some proxies? And there are a number of possibilities with respect to such naturally occurring experiments. One idea that occurred to me was to use shipwrecks, where groups of people were thrown together without intending it, and were required somehow to make some kind of social order anew. And so out of the over 9,000 shipwrecks that occurred between 1500 and 1900 during the European exploration of the Earth, I was able to identify 20 where the castaways numbered more than 19 people and where they were stranded for more than 2 months. And they are shown here on this map in a kind of archipelago of shipwrecks. And I studied in detail what sort of social order they made for themselves, using all available written accounts of the survivors and also archaeological excavations of the wreck sites. And the archaeological excavations could give us some insights. For instance, was the group able to work together to make a kind of a fire tower or something that required more than one person to contribute? Or was there kind of a hierarchy in the living arrangements? You know, did they have separate quarters for the passengers and the crew, or for the officers and the sailors, for example? So the archaeological excavations could also give us some insights in what kind of social order these communities, these castaway communities, could make. And one particularly powerful pair of cases involved two crews stranded on opposite ends of this island, which is north of Antarctica and south of New Zealand, who were stranded, believe it or not, on the same island at the same time in 1864, though they were unaware of each other's fates. And this was almost a perfect natural experiment in social order. The Grafton wrecked on the southern part of the island in that bay that's shown in the slide, and the Inverco wrecked on the northern part of the island. And in the Grafton, the entire crew of 5 people survived. But in the Inverco, all but 3 of the 19 castaways died. Now, this was an extraordinary. Actually, what's amazing about this case is that the accounts of the Grafton crew, they were exploring the island, and one day they had hiked north, and they thought they saw a fire, a smoke from a fire further up north, which I think was probably the Inverco crew. And they went looking, but the crews did not bump into each other. Now, in the Grafton, when the ship wrecked on the shore, the captain of the ship had already had a high fever and was in his cabin. And 4 of the men make it ashore, and then they decide, at great personal risk to themselves, to set up a rope line from the shore to the boat to rescue the captain. And so this wreck begins with the act of the group working together, to risking their own lives to save the captain's life. On the other hand, on the Inverco, when the 19 men wreck, 19 men make it ashore, and one of the men had a broken extremity. They're on a little beach, and there's a big cliff above them. And the Inverco crew decides to abandon this man to his death. And the 18 of them climb up the cliff. And then of those 18, only 3 of them ultimately survive. And there was some unfortunate episodes of cannibalism during that as well. The Grafton crew, however, and I need to be clear that it wasn't pleasant being a subject of these unintentional natural experiments. But the Grafton crew was able to work together and build a dwelling. They actually survived for 2 years. They built a forge. They melted down iron and made nails. They fabricated a boat. Then half of them set sail and got a ship to come back and rescue the others. Now, I also looked not only at unintentional communities, but at intentional communities, such as 19th century communes, where people deliberately set out to remake society, possibly in a new way. And in fact, people have been doing this since at least Roman times. We have thousands of years of records of people saying, you know, society is screwed up. We're just going to go, try again in the wilderness. And I looked at the Shakers and other communitarian movements in the United States, and at 20th century communes too, and at kibbutzes in Israel, and at settlements of scientists in Antarctica. So every year, as many of you probably know, a group of, 30 or 40 people winter over on the South Pole. And there's no one coming in or going out for 9 or 10 months during this period. And this group of people have to make some kind of social order. And I also looked at other classic examples, such as the Polynesian expansion, whereby settlers spread out throughout the Pacific, creating new societies on all of these isolated islands. And at online worlds, for example, so you would think that we were released from our corporeal bodies when we can, create social order in these virtual worlds. Might we do something different? Turns out we don't. We simply recreate what we already make. And at many other examples, such as nuclear subcrews, or Latin American prisons, or miners stranded deep beneath the earth, and communities formed by displaced persons in the wake of natural disasters. And finally, I looked at experiments that we've been doing in my lab for, I don't know, almost 20 years now, where we create temporary artificial societies of real people. We've developed software where we can recruit online research subjects, bring them into this virtual world of ours, or this experiment of ours, and then in a godlike way, manipulate different features of the social order in order to see what kinds of structures or features optimize collective human performance. We've had over 40,000 people that participated in these experiments where we manipulate various aspects of social interactions, allowing us to probe the deep underpinnings of social order. And what I found was that there were some deep and fundamental principles that constrain us to only one way of being social. And I'd like to illustrate this by reference to a very famous example of the world of all possible shells that I suspect many in this audience know. In the 1960s, as you probably know, paleontologist David Raup became fascinated by shell morphology and whether it was possible to unify the world of shells with a single equation. And he devised the following way of thinking about it, arraying shells in a three-dimensional space that he called a morphospace. Now, there's been subsequent work. There's some mathematical details here which are quite interesting. There have been some subsequent work expanding the dimensionality of this problem. But for now, I'm going to go with a classic Raup setup. So in this setup, Raup imagined that there were three parameters that might describe the shape of a shell. And they're illustrated here on three axes in this cube. Now, what he called distance, which is on the y-axis on the far right, is a parameter that describes the rate at which the coil moves away from the axis, like a coil of stamps. So I think in England, they probably sell stamps in tight coils, not just in sheets. You could have a tight coil where the stamps are tightly coiled, or a looser coil. And the rate of that loosening is what we can call the distance. Another parameter is what can be called the translation, and that's shown on the x-axis. And that is the rate at which the shell winds around a vertical axis, like a slinky or a spring. You can imagine a very loose spring or a very compact spring, and that's another parameter. And last, on the z-axis going up and down, is what he called the expansion, or the rate of change of the opening. So this is, you can imagine the animal that lives inside the shell. If you were walking into the shell, would it be like a cylinder, so it was sort of a constant all the way down, or was it like a cone? As you got further and further back, it was tighter and tighter, and the rate at which that happened could be called the expansion. And it turns out that manipulating these three parameters gives you a world of all possible shell shapes, or this morphospace. But what's interesting is that when Raup plotted all shells that had ever been discovered, or even that existed in the distant past, they only occupied a tiny fraction of the morphospace, shown here in gray. So many types of shells, so that is to say, only a small part of the space was actually occupied. And many types of shells that were theoretically conceivable, nonetheless, have never existed. Now imagine that we define some similar axes for societies, like how friendly societies are, or how cooperative they are, or how unequal they are, or how much hierarchy they have, or their propensity to manifest social learning, or the playfulness of their children, and so on. If we did that, we would find that all observed societies actually occupy only a small part of the theoretical morphospace. And so the question is why that is the case, and the answer is natural selection. The key capabilities, the key capacities that we humans have that universally characterize our societies and that we need so as to be able to form a functional society, in my view, are the following: identity, love, friendship, networks, cooperation, in-group preference, mild hierarchy, and teaching. And I call this the social suite. These are genetically encoded attributes shaped by natural selection that we express among ourselves interpersonally, not as isolated individuals. So, for example, something like religion is something you can have on your own. You can have religious beliefs on your own. Or bravery is a trait you can manifest on your own. But all of these traits are traits that require other people for their manifestation. And these traits are adaptively useful, even crucial for making a society. And indeed, natural selection has shaped not just the structure and function of our bodies, not just the structure and function of our minds and hence our behaviors, but also the structure and function of our societies. In my view, these traits are universal and they are seen in every society. And in the time I have with you this morning or this afternoon, I'm going to just look at it, give you a taste of just a few of them and explore some of the implications of this claim about the social suite. Now, one of the greatest paradoxes about mammalian social life is that the capacity to be a distinctive individual is actually an essential predicate for living socially. The abilities to express and also to recognize individuality only evolve when it is beneficial. That is to say, and these two capacities are actually extremely rare in the animal kingdom. To signal your individual identity and to detect the individual identity of other animals. But if you do not want others to attack you mistakenly, or to forget that they have had sex with you, or to provide parental care to a different child and thus neglect you as an infant, or to neglect to repay your kindness, or to forget where they left off your lesson in how to do something complicated, then it is advantageous to have some way to signal, this is me, not someone else, and to have other people recognize that signal. In other words, social interactions require that we have the ability to communicate our individuality. And in our species, we use our faces for this purpose. Their unique appearance and our cognitive ability to detect such differences is actually an evolutionary luxury. In other words, ask why we don't all have, why our elbows all look very similar, but our faces all look very different. And we can detect the differences. You can't identify your friends by what their elbows look like, but you certainly can identify them by what their faces look like. Why don't we all have the same face? Or why don't we have, a male face and a female face, or a prepubescent face and a post-pubescent face? We all have individual faces, and people can identify those faces. We devote a significant fraction of our brain to identifying people's faces. And if you have a defect in that, a neurologic defect in that called prosopagnosia, that's actually a social handicap, not being able to identify people's faces. Now, this comes about, this variety in faces comes about in part because variation in one trait in your face, for example, the width of your nose or the height of your nose or the shape of your ear or the angle of your cheekbone, that all of those traits are independent of variation in other traits. And so they are endlessly recombinable. This is work done by another lab that looked, for example, at the correlation in the width of people's hands and the length of people's hands, shown here in the Y and the X axis. And unsurprisingly, as hands get longer, they get wider, and there's a very good correlation. But on the right hand, if you look at people's noses, the width of their nose and the height of their nose has no relationship or uncorrelated, which is exactly what you would want if you wanted to make the face have the maximum variety of possible facial appearances. You want every facial parameter to be relatively uncorrelated with every other facial parameter. And in fact, new research has revealed the great genotypic variability that underlies our facial phenotypes. Actually very similar to the variability in our immune systems or in our olfactory systems, actually. So there's a tremendous variety, allelic variation that gives rise to the shape of our faces. So the basic point is that while all kidneys should, in principle, look and work alike, all faces should look different in order to achieve their objective. Love is another universal trait. Our species is unusual among mammals in that we don't just have sex with our mates, we bond with them. We form a sustained, sentimental, emotional attachment to them. We love them. And love is not essential for mating, but we do it anyway. in part because it helps us to raise our young. And even though marriage systems around the world vary, as shown here, this fundamental fact of bonding and love does not vary. In every society, if you look at the anthropological data, they did talk about love and how they love their partners. So we don't just mate with each other, but it turns out we don't just mate with each other. We also befriend each other. And humans are unusual as a species in that we form volitional, long-term, non-reproductive unions with unrelated conspecifics. Volitional, long-term, non-reproductive unions with unrelated conspecifics. That's the scientific way of saying we have friends. And this is seen in every society. And the key attributes of friendships are also quite consistent around the world. And they are manifested very early in life. For example, they include mutual aid. If you ask people, if you go around everywhere, every society has friends, which, by the way, as I just alluded to, is a very unusual phenotype. We have friends. Certain other primates have friends. Elephants, both Asian and African elephants have friends, and certain cetacean species have friends. And not only is friendship universal in human societies, but also the attributes of those societies are almost universal. So if you interview people in various societies, what's important about friendship, they'll say mutual aid, friends help each other, or they'll say positive affect, you feel good in the company of your friends, and certain other traits as well. Now, my lab has fanned out around the world to study friendship and distinctly to map the social networks that they give rise to. In one paper that was published in Nature in 2012, what we did in that paper is we created a photographic census of all living adult Hadza. The Hadza hunter-gatherers are one of the last surviving hunter-gatherer populations on the planet. They live in the ancestral human environment around Lake Eyasi in Tanzania. There are only about 1,000 of them left. They hunt and they gather for their food. They sleep out under the stars. They have very few material possessions to speak of. We made a photographic census of all living adult Hadza, and we printed them on these posters like a kind of Hadza Facebook. And we took those posters into the field, and then my then postdoc at the time, Karen Apicella, camped out around Lake Eyasi, and she would just wait for a Hadza person to walk by. And because you can't make an appointment with Hadza people. And then one of them would walk by and she would say, "Excuse me, could you tell me who your friends are?" And they would point to their friends and she'd, "Thank you very much." And off they would go. And then the next person, she'd wait another week for another person to walk by. And so painstakingly, we mapped the social networks of the Hadza. And what we found was that their patterns of friendship and social interaction are just like those patterns that we manifest in more modernized settings with all of the things that we have. That is, despite the fact that in the last 10,000 years, we've invented agriculture and cities and telecommunications, the social networks that we make are the same as the social networks that the Hadza make. And my lab has asked people to identify their friends in another way, in a number of ways, and we have mapped the social networks in many places around the world. For example, in Honduras, this is a village in Honduras, a village in India, and a village in Uganda. And every dot is a person, and every line is a social relationship between two people. For example, who's friends. And if you look at these different networks from different villages with different cultural settings in different parts of the world, you should see visually, and it turns out mathematically, these networks have a startling consistency. And in fact, that human social network structure has a basically universal manifestation. But very pertinently, however, elephants and dolphins, as I mentioned, also have friendships. And their networks are also very similar to ours, mathematically speaking. Here is an elephant social network that was mapped by Sherwin De Silva using, this is an Asian elephants. Now so every dot is an elephant, and the lines represent affiliative ties between these elephants, between pairs of elephants. And our last known ancestor with elephants was about 85 million years ago. And yet we make friends and networks in very similar ways to them. So natural selection has independently come up with this very uncommon practice. And I don't need to tell this audience what the reason for this might be. This is an example of convergent evolution, where organisms independently evolve to be similar, solving similar challenges in similar ways. And these two cute creatures shared a common ancestor over 200 million years ago that looked nothing like this, and yet they independently evolved in such similar ways in the more recent past. We usually think about this process with respect to physical features, but of course it's not limited in that way. And this observation about the convergent evolution of friendship and social networks leads us to another paradox, which is that to the extent that we resemble animals in our propensity for friendship or other traits like cooperation, we actually gain insight into our own common humanity. Because if we can share the capacity for friendship with elephants, surely we can share it universally with each other. Now, the actual structure of these networks that we make matters to our life experience. And when I talk about this, I like to invoke this metaphor. Think about these two objects. As you all learned in high school chemistry, they are both made of carbon. Connect the carbon atoms one way, you get graphite, which is soft and dark. Take the same carbon atoms and connect them another way, you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are two key intellectual ideas here. First of all, these properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness do not inhere in the carbon atoms. They are properties of the collection of carbon atoms. And second, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. Connect the carbon atoms one way, you get one set of properties. Connect them another way, you get a completely different set of properties. Similarly, it's the pattern of our connections that affects the properties of our social groups. It's the ties between people that make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. In fact, new properties such as cooperation or epidemic resistance can emerge because of the connections, because of the ties between people, and not necessarily because of the people themselves. And so it's not just what is happening in the people around us that matters. Our experience of the world also depends on the actual structure of the ties around us, near and far. And these collective social structures, these networks that we make, can have emergent properties. In other words, this social order, which we are pre-wired to make, these social networks that we necessarily must make, matter for our survival. And this creates a feedback loop in evolution, which has helped to shape the social suite and these manifestations. Now, this phenomenon of emergence has other consequences. And the social suite has come to be shaped by natural selection in a variety of ways as a result. The point here is that we make these intricate social worlds for ourselves, and these worlds, it turns out, affect us as much as we affect them. Now, one set of ideas regarding the mechanism for this relates to the notion of an exophenotype, whereby genes guide an animal to create things outside its body. I'm going to digress here to tell you a story, because about 20 years ago, we did this paper, which I'm not presenting to you today, in which we did a twin study in which we found that the structure of the social networks made by monozygotic twins were more similar than the structure of the social networks made by pairs of dizygotic twins, same-sex dizygotic twins. And I began to realize that genes in me, like if you had Tom, Dick, and Harry in a room, whether Dick is friends with Harry could depend not just on Dick's genes or on Harry's genes, but on Tom's genes. So hold on, I just got some signal from Microsoft Teams. But anyway, so this is very weird. You know, how could that be? That whether Dick is friends with Harry could depend on Tom's genes. Well, the reason is that Tom might introduce Dick and Harry to each other. We humans knit the network around us together. We shape the network around us together. And at the time, I was reading about what psychiatrists call endophenotypes, which is, psychiatric phenotypes that we have inside us that aren't, on our bodies. And I began to think, oh my God, our genes could could create things outside our bodies. And I thought, oh, I'm going to call this exophenotypes. And I was working with my partner James Fowler at the time, and I was like, oh my God, this is an incredible idea. You know, our genes can have effects outside our bodies. They don't stop at the limit of our corporeal bodies. This is an incredible idea. And I started really thinking about this, and we started designing experiments to test this idea. This was about, I don't know, this was 20 years ago now. And then I discovered that, of course, Richard Dawkins had this idea, 30 years earlier in his fantastic book called The Extended Phenotype. So we had rediscovered this idea. We had invented a new term for it. I prefer the term exophenotype because actually some of the wrinkles that we've added, we have in my lab generated sort of empirical support for this as applies to human beings and social order. So now with that digression, let me come back to explaining why this is important here. This notion of an exophenotype, whereby genes guide an animal to create things outside its body. So let's consider a beaver dam. A beaver has to make a dam. It's programmed to make a dam. Beavers aren't taught to make dams. They will make dams of a specific kind, with specific materials, with a specific height, in specific locations, because they have to. But when the beaver does this, when it dams up a little stream, it creates it modifies its environment. It creates still water of a different depth with a different perimeter than otherwise would have existed in the environment. So now it's created a new environmental selection pressure for itself. And so now maybe beavers that have, by chance, mutations that give them bigger lungs or a capacity to stay underwater longer, they thrive better in an environment that they have now been programmed to make. So beavers that make bigger dams wind up having bigger lungs across generations, and beavers with bigger lungs can now actually make even bigger dams. And you get this sort of feedback loop whereby the animal is reshaping its environment, and that reshaping is then feeding back on. The animal is programmed to implement the selection pressures on itself. So this artifact that the beaver make creates new selection pressures, by the way, also in other animals. By changing, new fish can evolve to live in these pools, and new plants can evolve. But what's interesting to me is not the fact that the beaver is creating a selection pressure on other animals, like a predator might, for instance, but a selection pressure on itself. So here's the point of this analogy, because humans have evolved to manipulate the social world around us. We're not like beavers knitting sticks together. We make social networks. We knit other people together. We modify the social world around us, and this in turn makes certain types of genes more advantageous than others, creating a feedback loop across evolution. Friendly people make friendly worlds and do better in friendly worlds, and the same goes with cooperative people. We make particular sorts of social worlds, and those who can do well in such social worlds grow more numerous, as do their genes. Now, the traits that make up the social suite are mutually supportive. Many of these play roles in others. So identity is obviously required for love and friendship. You have to know who's who. And friendship and networks work better or help support cooperation. We are better able to cooperate with others, it turns out, in a bunch of work we've done and that others like Martin Nowak and David Rand have done that I'm not going into today. The existence of friendship and networks facilitates the emergence of cooperation, both within groups and across evolutionary time. In-group preference is also very important for cooperation. And mild hierarchy is important for cooperation. And teaching, which is extraordinary, that we have, requires that is a kind of cooperation and requires that we have specific, we teach our friends things and so on. So all of these traits, in ways that I won't go into today, are interdigitated and mutually supportive. But I do want to say a few words about teaching in particular, because our capacity for teaching lies at the root of our capacity for culture. Now, most animals can learn, obviously, and they learn by something known as independent learning, by contact with their environment. So a little fish can learn that if it swims up to the light, it will find food there. But some animals, a few of them, also learn socially, by imitating other animals. So for example, you put your hand in the fire and you learn that it burns, and you learn something, fire burns, but you've paid a price, you have a burnt hand. Or I can watch you put your hand in the fire, and I gain almost as much knowledge, fire burns, but I pay none of the price. So social learning is super efficient. But we do something even more remarkable and very rare in the animal kingdom, which is that we teach each other things. I teach you to build a fire. And this allows us, this ability allows us to cumulatively create and store knowledge and transmit it across time and place. It allows us to be cultural animals, in other words. And the knowledge that we transmit across time and space in the form of teaching is also, as it turns out, a fundamental driver of economic growth across thousands or hundreds of years or decades. And this, it turns out, shapes us even more. Our genes affect our capacity for culture, and our culture affects our genes. Now, this is a further distinct idea from the sort of innate formation of social networks and exophenotypes I just mentioned. This idea sounds similar to the exophenotype idea, but it's actually different, because what's genetically encoded here is our capacity for teaching, not the specific kinds of cultural artifacts or behaviors that we make. But yet those specific cultural things that we happen to make actually also can change the course of our evolution. Now, the best example of this so far, as I suspect many of you know, is the macro historical development of how macro historical developments could affect our genes, is the evolution of lactose tolerance in adults. Now, the ability of adults to digest lactose, which is the principal sugar in milk, confers evolutionary advantages only when a stable supply of milk is available, such as after milk-producing animals have been domesticated. So, up until about 10,000 years ago, all human beings on the planet, we had the enzyme lactase in our intestinal tract, in our stomach, in our intestinal tract, to digest the lactose that we consumed when we suckled at our mother's breasts. But then, after we were weaned, the lactase was turned off. We had something called lactase non-persistence, because, of course, we never encountered lactose again. Once we were weaned, we never ever saw milk again. It would have been evolutionarily inefficient for us to continue to produce this enzyme lactase. But then what happened? Multiple times between 9 and 3,000 years ago, human beings domesticated milk-producing animals. We had this cultural innovation. We invented ideas and technologies that allowed us to husband camels and goats and sheep and cows and so on. We, via culture, changed our environment and added milk to our environment, such that now, occasionally, humans who happen to have a mutation such that you had lactase persistence, those human beings could now out-survive and out-reproduce the human beings who had lactase non-persistence. Why? Well, because now they had an additional food source, milk, that they could consume, and an additional source of hydration they could use when water was spoiled in their environment. And amazingly, several adaptive mutations have occurred in widely separated populations in Africa and Europe just over the last 3,000 to 9,000 years, all conferring the ability to digest lactose. And these mutations are principally seen in populations of people who are herders and not in nearby populations who retained a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And hence, something that we learn to do, changes the course of our evolution. And over the long haul, teaching changes our genes. And our genes and our culture are in conversation. You can actually even think of climate change as that. Climate change, anthropogenic climate change, is a cultural artifact. And the human beings that are alive in 10,000 years will be different than those that would have been alive had we not modified our environment in this fashion. And there are actually many amazing examples of this, and a lot of work that Kevin Lalonde has done and his colleagues have done over the years. And there's some reviews of this that describes other examples of this. Now, I'd like to close with a couple of applications of some of these ideas about the social suite, and then with one final big idea, and then I'll take some questions. Because there are a number of applications of all of these ideas about how we evolved to make societies. And I'd like to focus on one sort of general illustration before closing. Because, for instance, we humans are beginning to modify our social systems with artificial intelligence. We are increasingly adding machines, such as driverless cars, or automated checkout clerks, or warehouse robots, or digital assistants to our real face-to-face encounters. And we're adding autonomous agents, such as online bots, to our online social systems. And these machines will act in human-like ways on a level playing field as if they were human, in what I call hybrid systems of humans and machines. And these hybrid systems offer opportunities for a new kind of social artificial intelligence. An AI might act socially, or it might also actually affect our social organization. Let me give you one toy example of this to fix ideas. The manufacturer of a digital assistant like an Alexa is very concerned with the human-machine interaction, optimizing that machine for its user. You would never buy an Alexa if every time you had to speak to it, you had to say, "Excuse me, Alexa, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but if you don't mind, would you please tell me the weather tomorrow?" This would be an absurd level of obsequious. You wouldn't buy such a machine. You expect to be able to say, "Alexa, weather," and the machine obediently responds. And that's fine until you bring that machine into your home and your children, in interacting with that machine, learn to be rude. And then they go to the playground and they are rude to other children. So what my laboratory has been studying is not human-machine interactions, but human-human interactions in the presence of machines. And in fact, what we've been doing is we've been working not to develop super smart AI to replace human cognition, like ChatGPT and large language models or Claude, but rather we've been working to develop what we call dumb AI to supplement human interaction. Can simple forms of AI, when added to groups of much smarter humans, help the humans to help themselves? And we think so. And I'm just going to review a couple of experiments, recent experiments in our lab, to illustrate this point. Here's one experiment involving simple AI that we've deployed to exploit our understanding of the evolutionary blueprint for human groups. As I said, cooperation, I didn't say, but as you probably all know, cooperation in human groups is challenging, and various mechanisms are required to sustain cooperation, although it usually nevertheless decays with time. So in the top row, I show, this is a paper published in 2020. In the top row, I show the typical result of an experiment in which a group of people are brought together and put into a network. Each person is introduced to their neighbors. And then these people is given a challenge, something known as a public goods game, which is an economic game that is designed to measure how well these people can work with their neighbors to produce something of common utility, a public good. So in the upper left-hand column, there's a group of people. They're dropped in. These are experimental subjects. They're dropped into a network. They're introduced to their neighbors, and they're asked to contribute a little bit of money to their neighbors. And if they do that, we'll double the money. So their neighbors will get this extra benefit, but they have to pay a price. And what's optimal is for everyone to make maximum contributions, because then everyone gets their money doubled all the time. But obviously, each individual has a temptation to defect and cheat and say, well, why should I give anything? I hope all my neighbors will contribute, and then I'll get a benefit, and I'll pay no price. So on the upper left-hand column, you see that the blue, the kind, altruistic, cooperative people are in blue. The mean, the selfish defectors are in red. Most of the people start out as blue. And what happens in that group, as you can all easily imagine, is that people start mostly being nice, but then the few defectors start exploiting the nice people. And then you're sitting there saying, well, why should I be nice to my neighbors? They're not being nice to me. I'll also stop being nice. And then defection takes over the system, so that by the end of the experiment, after multiple rounds, you have mostly red defectors shown in the upper right. In a different branch of the experiment, however, as shown in the lower left, we added some bots. And these bots were endowed with a very simple form of artificial intelligence where they would basically do a little bit of rewiring in the background, brokering introductions between people and encouraging people who were nice to each other to form connections and to cut ties to defectors. And that kind of bot, as shown on the lower right, allows cooperation not only to be preserved, but actually to increase in this situation. And we did this experiment with over 1,000 subjects in 64 groups. And we found that the cooperation rate in the whole group could actually be increased from about 60% to about 80% by the end. So, by exploiting ideas about identity, networks, cooperation, and social learning, simple artificial intelligence could increase the cooperation of human groups. Let me show you one other. We've done many experiments like this, but I'll show you one other. We've also begun to experiment with, in physical groups, with humanoid and non-humanoid robots in these physical systems. And this is an experiment we published in PNAS also in 2020. In this experiment, we took a group of 4 entities, 3 humans and 1 humanoid robot, and we gave them a collective action problem. We devised this little game like Thomas the Tank Engine, where they had to lay railroad tracks from one point to another point on a tablet computer. And then we contrived to sometimes make that game impossible to solve. So there were straight pieces and curved pieces. You should have the intuition that if you're going to get from point A to point B, you might need just the right number of curves of a certain direction, but we might not give you those right curves. And so the group of people would fail in their challenge. And what we did in this experiment is we manipulated the manner of speech of the robot. For example, we had the robot express vulnerability. So it might say, there are multiple rounds of this game. The robot might say, we did not succeed in this round, which would be a sort of, not a personal statement, a kind of descriptive statement. Or it would say something like, I made a mistake in this round. The robot would use the I pronoun, for example. Or we also had the robots tell dad jokes. Probably all of you know what dad jokes are. Those are the ridiculous and stupid and embarrassing jokes that fathers tell to their children and make everyone cringe. By the way, this is a cultural universal. Anthropologists have studied dad jokes in other societies. If you go to Amazonia and ask, do the fathers in your society tell these really stupid jokes? Oh my God, yes, our fathers do that too. We hate it. So we had the robot tell dad jokes. And then we had video cameras set up in these rooms, and we looked at the volume and equality of communication among the humans in the group, not between the humans and the robot. And those are shown in the cartoons on the right in this slide. The width of the lines show the volume of communication between the human beings. And you can see that when the robot expressed vulnerability in the blue middle cartoon, the width of the lines is larger than in the gray cartoon on the far right, and the quality of those cartoons, of those lines, is also higher. So we find that people in groups with robots making vulnerable statements converse substantially more with each other, distribute their conversations somewhat more equally, and perceive their groups more positively compared to control groups with a robot that either makes neutral statements or no statements at the end of each of the rounds of this game. So shifts in robot speech have the power not only to affect how people interact with robots, but also how people interact with each other, offering the prospect for modifying social interaction, via the introduction of artificial agents into hybrid systems of humans and machines. Now, in short, humans can learn to interact better by having bots among us, and not just among those humans directly connected to the bots. The bots help the humans to help themselves. And we're building on this work to design and add simple bots to these other situations involving diverse social dilemmas and collective action problems. So we've done a lot of experiments now in the last 10 years showing that we can add AI to social systems and enhance the ability of human groups to coordinate and cooperate and communicate and evacuate and navigate and share. And so my argument is that hybrid systems will need to respect the social suite if they are to facilitate a utopian rather than dystopian future. When you think about what AI is going to do to us, if you want the AI to be helpful, if you want the AI to actually contribute to a positive future for human beings, it has to be designed in a way that supports rather than degrades the elements of a social suite that we discussed earlier. All right, let me close. This is my last idea, 2 slides, and then we can have a conversation, I hope. And I hope you all will turn on your video cameras so I can see you when we have our conversation. Because our focus today on the social origins of goodness also highlights something else. Most human virtues are social, and they arise from the investment in the lives of others. We do not care very much if you love yourself, or are kind to yourself, or are just to yourself. We care whether you manifest these virtues to other human beings. So I'd like to close with a final idea. What accounts for our species' general success in living together in the face of all of our defects and differences? How can we understand the goodness of the social world despite the badness that I opened with, at the beginning of this talk? Now, in theology, this is known as a question of theodicy. How is God to be justified in the face of all the evil in the world? This is a long-standing problem in theology. If God is omnipotent and omniscient and beneficent, why is there so much suffering and evil? And I believe, analogously, we can also focus on what I call sociodicy. This is the vindication of our confidence in the virtue of society, despite its numerous failures, so obvious to anyone. And this idea is in keeping with the Japanese aesthetic philosophy of wabi-sabi, highlighting the flawed beauty of natural and artificial things. So this is an extremely valuable and beautiful bowl made by a Japanese potter. And to me, this bowl looks hauntingly beautiful. It's a completely different than the Western sensibility, of like fine china being beautiful. And the imperfections in this bowl are precisely what make it so appealing and vindicate our confidence in it. Now, I believe this is not just idle optimism. Rather, it's a recognition of the fundamental good that lies within us. It's tempting to look at human history as full of abject misery and dysfunction. You can pick any century or millennium and find it replete with horrors. Now, there was, of course, a dramatic inflection for the better that occurred in the 18th century with the arrival of the Enlightenment and its philosophical values and scientific discoveries. Steven Pinker and others have argued, correctly in my view, that beginning in England about 200 or 300 years ago, all of these philosophical moves about the equality of human beings, about the importance of reason, about democracy, spread out around the world and helped contribute to a better world. And likewise, all the scientific discoveries of the Enlightenment, the electricity and magnetism and the steam engine, and so on, also contributed. Life has become longer, richer, freer, and more peaceful as a result. But here's my argument. We do not have to rely solely on such recent historical developments to make the world better. As I've been showing you, more ancient and more powerful and deeper forces are at work, propelling a good society. In short, the arc of our evolutionary history is long, but it bends towards goodness. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Nicholas. That was really fascinating, with very important messages at the end about how we can use your ideas to improve the world. Does anybody like to raise your hand to ask a question to Nicholas?
And I'd be very grateful if people would turn on their video camera so I can see them, I think, and it's just more personal.
Yeah. While we're waiting for others, Nicholas, could I ask you a question? I'm fascinated by your data and your experiments, but most of them seem to be relatively small scale. By relatively small scale, I mean a few hundred at most, down to lower numbers. One of our members is Robin Dunbar. I don't think he's with us today, but Robin, I don't know if you know of his work, as Dunbar's number.
Yes, I know Robin.
Yeah, okay, good. So you know that his number.
I visited him at Magdalen College more than once.
So he's saying that up to about 150 people, roughly, We can remember faces, we can remember personalities.
Yes.
There's a good chance of meeting again. We take into account faces, as you emphasize, facial expressions, mood, all these things. And we can do that very effectively on numbers less than 200. But when we get above that, which we have done frequently in the last 5,000 years, before then we were almost entirely always in small groups. Now we're living in much larger communities since the rise of cities 5,000 years ago. Does that undermine, or how would you react to that point?
No, I discuss Robin's work in Blueprint. First of all, the experiments that I alluded to that we've done, the online experiments, have involved in many cases thousands of people. So we assemble them in groups of 20 or 30 or 40, but we might have 4,000 people in an experiment in 200 groups or something. So the scale is quite large actually for experimental social science. And also we've done experiments or studies which I alluded to, of mapping networks of real villages around the world. And many of those villages have hundreds of people. I didn't discuss this today, but we have a big project in Honduras of 30,000 people in 176 villages. And we've been following those villages for 10 years. And those villages range in size from like 100 to 800 people. So we've definitely studied these phenomena in groups that transcend Dunbar's number. The online experiments, of course, people are anonymized. They don't see each other, and they don't have a long-standing relationship. So they are stylized experiments. Of course, the natural experiments are the opposite extreme. The people are face-to-face. They know each other in a village. And we just have a paper right now that's forthcoming on cooperation in these villages, looking at the extent to which some of the questions you asked hold. And the basic answer is that it of course matters. Robin's ideas absolutely matter. The manifestation of these properties is different in groups that are face-to-face and small scale rather than more anonymous, but that we evolved in the ancestral environment in smaller groups, and we carry forward those traits even in our larger groups. And just as a small closing footnote, of course, it's much more challenging to achieve cooperation in larger groups, which is one of the reasons I think we manifest all of these systems to decrease group size. We form little groups to sort of have a more convivial environment for us to actually be able to more easily manifest these traits.
Thank you very much. Fanish would like to come in.
I thought Brian was ahead of me. Is that right, Brian?
Yeah, you go ahead, Fanish. I'll ask my question next.
Thank you.
Sorry, Brian, but I'll come to you in a minute.
Great pleasure to hear your talk. I'm a big fan of your book. I wanted to ask you about the notion of mild hierarchy that you talk about in the book as well. And do you mean literally like there are a few layers, but there are only a few, or there's just one layer and the degree of authority exerted by the person on the top is benign? Because these have quite different implications in our world in organizations.
I don't think it has to be just two layers. Like there are different ways of conceptualizing hierarchy. You can look at, for example, the concentration of material resources. And some people have used something called the Gini coefficient, which is a number that varies between 0 and 1 and captures economic inequality. 0 is everyone has the same amount of resources. One person has all the resources, everyone else has nothing. A Gini in the United States right now is at a century-long high. It's about 0.4. A typical Gini in a Scandinavian society is about 0.25 or something. When people have looked at hunter-gatherer societies, they don't have a Gini of 0. They have a Gini of about 0.12. So among the Hadza, so some amount of economic inequality is seen even in very traditional small-scale societies, and actually shouldn't surprise us because natural abilities are also randomly assigned by a Darwinian process. We're not all born with the same abilities and talents. There's some natural inequality. The natural lottery works, and then there's also a social lottery. But the natural lottery doesn't give us all equal abilities, so there'll be some inequality in who's a better hunter than someone else. They might therefore have more resources, and so on. So the question is, And then Richard Wrangham has done work more in the line of what you're talking about on despotic hierarchies, like to what extent do we tolerate being lorded over by other members of our species? And Richard has talked about the self-domestication hypothesis, which I suspect you also are familiar with, which is the idea that, we'll tolerate a little bit of policing and, ordering from above. But if it gets to be too much, we'll band together and kill that guy, and we won't tolerate it. So there's a variety of work that's been done that looks at how do groups perform optimally, and this is the work that's summarized in the book, that show when it comes to the distribution of power and resources, we don't do well when everything is equal, and we don't do well when it's very unequal. We tend to do better when there's some mild hierarchy, mild inequality. So none of those results speak to your question about do we need 2 layers or 3 or 4, but that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the distribution of resources when I speak about mild hierarchy. One other experiment I discuss in the book is some experiment that Jessica Flack did with, Franz de Waal on experiments with a hierarchy in rhesus macaques, where you find a very peaceful group of macaques, and then everyone's getting along just fine. Food is being, shared well enough, and so on. And then they remove the leader of the group and take him away. And then all hell breaks out in the group. They're violent towards each other and so on. So you need a little bit of order, a little bit of hierarchy to maintain a kind of more peaceful social order. These experiments in another primate showed.
Okay, thank you.
Did I
Brian.
answer your question? Did I answer the question? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, yeah, sure. Yeah, come in, finish.
So Nick, I was interested in what you might have learned from any disconfirming cases or apparently disconfirming cases, societies or contexts where the blueprint or the suite seemed not to express itself.
So first of all, I have to be careful. I blew by it, and I'm sure there were some in the audience who caught this. The Raup World of All Possible Shells is an interspecies comparison, whereas, of course, all the societies are manifested by our species. So strictly speaking, that World of All Possible Shells exercise should have been conducted across primate species. So even if we were to find a society which has a disconfirming example, it wouldn't necessarily disconfirm it for our whole species. However, I'd like to address your question in the following way, and I talk about this in the last chapter of the book. For example, play is universal in human societies, and apparently there's one culture in the world, in New Guinea, I believe. I discussed it in the book, but I don't remember the name of the group, where they really frown on children's play. So this would shock us to hear, but when children reach for a toy, they'll burn the child's hand. They think play is bad. And they apply a lot of force, a lot of cultural force is applied to prevent children from playing. I mean, they literally burn the hands of the kids to stop them from playing, okay? Now the existence of that doesn't disconfirm the universality of play. It just shows that a very powerful cultural force has to be applied to stop this innate tendency that we have. And likewise for elements of the social suite, you can see totalitarian regimes like Pol Pot, for example, or communist regimes that that say, we're going to treat everyone the same. We're all going to dress the same. We're going to call each other comrade. We're going to decrease individual identity and decrease dyadic sentiment. You're not supposed to be attached to personal friends. You're not supposed to be attached to your family. You're supposed to be devoted to the state and to dear leader. And you can have societies like that, like in East Germany, where everyone was reporting on everyone else. You couldn't trust your friends anymore. You didn't know what was going on. You can have societies like that. Or, for example, another classic example is collective child rearing. People have thought about collective child rearing because child rearing imposes such a heavy burden on women in particular for obvious biological reasons. People have thought about collective child rearing, and it contributes to sex inequality, have thought about it for thousands of years. Plato talks about collective child rearing in the Republic, and it's been attempted many, many times, including most in our century in Israeli kibbutzes. But invariably, it is abandoned. People, theoretically, it seems like a good idea to have collective child rearing, but it never succeeds more than a generation or two because we love our babies. We love our children. It's so innate. So the point is, you can have these very powerful cultural, we have to apply a lot of cultural force, totalitarian regimes, burning children's hands, whatever it is, to try to suppress these innate tendencies. But invariably, they come back. You can't succeed over a long term, is my argument, which again is why that feathered into the point I was making about AI. To the extent that AI, works with the social suite, I think it will contribute to a utopian future. To the extent that these, tech moguls are thinking we're going to use AI to reshape society, I don't think that'll work. I think it's destined for failure.
Okay, thank you. Dietrich.
Thank you. And I appreciate your talk. Yeah, I'm Dietrich Stout. I'm a Paleolithic archaeologist at Emory University in the anthropology department. And I have kind of two unrelated questions. I'm hoping maybe one of them turns out to be interesting. But the first one, I guess we were just talking a little bit about the AI, and I was fascinated by your studies with the vulnerable robots. And how they could encourage cooperation. But then I was just wondering, how different is this from what people are doing with algorithms for more nefarious purposes, where you encourage certain kinds of online behavior because that's what gets you the engagement that you want and so forth. So are these similar things or different things, your work?
I can take the first question, and then I'm happy to answer the second. You're 100% right. Every single thing that we've done in my lab that is done to increase, because we do experiments that try to make groups better, increase cooperation, coordination, communication, creativity, and so on. You can reverse engineer them and degrade the capacity of groups. And actually, we know that some of our work that my group has published has been used by our enemies to subvert American society. So some of the things that we publish and other groups publish about how to optimize human performance has actually been used to degrade the solidarity in our society, fomenting discord in our societies. So yes is the answer to the question. So the same kind of technology can be used for evil purposes, like every technology, unfortunately. Did I answer that question?
Yeah, thanks. I wonder if I was making the right connection there, and unfortunately, that's very depressing. But
yes,
I guess we can keep trying.
No. Yeah, I mean, it is very depressing, and I mean, I think exploiting in-group preference or hierarchy. Like for example, Russia has for many years been encouraging gun ownership in the United States. It's actually a secret supporter of the NRA, and has also been fomenting racial discord in our society. I mean, basically, Russia wants us to arm ourselves and kill each other. It's like a long-term game, and this is this is seen, by the way, right now with a variety of let's say enemies of the West that are trying to deploy these technologies in a way that degrade our, what I would see as more natural inclination to work well together. By the way, I know I'm very optimistic and I'm very pro-social, but I'm aware of the fact that we also have vile tendencies of our own that no one needs to encourage. I'm not suggesting that absent outside forces, we would live in some kind of Eden. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that, we have both good and bad tendencies, and I would love us to support our good tendencies and avoid encouraging our bad tendencies, whether we do it or someone else does it.
Sure,
what was your second question?
Me too. Yeah, maybe the less negative. But you see, you have a social suite of maybe, I can't remember if it was 6 or 8 traits, and you discuss these as being evolved by natural selection. I just wonder. You also studied some comparative across species convergences, and I guess the name of the game for people in my line of work is trying to figure out where all these things came from. And do you see these as 6 or 8 separate adaptations, or is there maybe one underlying thing? People point to something like theory of mind, or there's a whole narrative about cooperative breeding leading to enhanced bonding and these kinds of things. So is this sort of like one key adaptation that has all of these effects under the right circumstances, or are these like 6 separate things, or 2 separate things, or 3? How do you think about that?
I'm willing to believe that they can be reduced from 8 to some smaller number, or that we might discern some underlying concept or even trait that could undergird them. I don't think there's good evidence for that yet, but I certainly don't preclude that. I was trying to think of, some of the work that I'm blocking his first name. He's a friend of mine, Lieberman at Harvard, the guy that does, the foot anatomy and
Dan. Yeah.
Dan Lieberman,
yeah.
He's a runner too. He's a nice guy. Anyway, Dan and Richard Wrangham talks about fire, and you have this, can we date when fire was invented by looking at rib anatomy? Perhaps some work that you do, I'm not sure. You see, well, because when we fire, we can cook our food, and as a result, it's pre-digested, so our masseter muscles can get smaller, and our teeth change, and our intestinal systems can change as a result of fire, and so our rib cage changes, and so we can see in the bones a signature of this cultural innovation, a million years later or whatever. So, in that kind of thinking, could and evidence could give rise to conclusions that the key innovation, just as you're suggesting, if we could find such evidence, actually was this ability, the capacity to, distinguish one person from another was like the crucial thing that, gave rise to all these things. Or the capacity, if I had to pick, it would probably be the capacity to form non-reproductive affiliative ties. In other words, to derive a fitness advantage from being someone's friend, and the kind of, the economies of scale and the complementarities, the occupational specialization and all of those things that supports, but I don't know what would be the evidence that we'd be able to find in the fossil record that would show us that friendship has arisen. Maybe if we could study burials, group burials, and we found, cases in which people and their children were buried versus cases in which genetic strangers seemingly were buried with each other. And if that changed at some point in the historical past, we'd say, okay, maybe this is when sort of friendship emerged. Of course, we didn't start practicing burials. I mean, I'm sure you know all this, So I don't know. I don't know how we would prove it, but I think it's testable. I mean, I think it's a falsifiable question you're asking.
Thank you.
Well, that's a great start. I'm encouraged by that. Yes, you did. Thank you.
Freak.
Hi. So first, Nicholas, thanks for making time for us. But I'm an organization scientist, and actually, like the first person to ask question, Fanny Sporedam, we both firmly believe that we should organize our companies much more in line with how we humans have evolved to form societies and cooperate and so on, including all the elements of the social suite, and certainly, of course, mild hierarchy and cooperation and networks. But I would say even love and friendship. But anyway. What we're interested in, and that's also because managers are often interested in that, how you can make deliberate interventions. And managers often say, of course, we'd like to change people's behaviors, and they often mean also we'd like to change people's norms. I was wondering who I was talking to.
Sorry, I got disconnected there for a second. Let me just, I also have to switch my thing. You were saying managers are interested in, but give me 1 second here, camera. Here we go. So can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I lost you when you were saying, and what managers are interested in, yeah?
Yeah, it's actually making deliberate interventions. And particularly they always say, of course, we would like to change people's behaviors in our organizations, or actually change people's norms. And of course, you spoke a little bit about making deliberate interventions, from creating networks to manipulating networks to introducing bots. But I was wondering if you could reflect that a little bit more, and particularly this element of changing norms to change cooperative patterns.
So we've done some work actually in organizations. We worked with the Tata conglomerate to study work groups. I've certainly given talks to Fortune 100 companies over the years about some of this. I'm not a management consultant. I don't have specific recommendations to make. And also, just to be clear, the forms of social order that are conducive to productivity in one domain might be very different than those that are conducive to productivity in another domain. So for example, a network structure that's optimized for the sharing of information among a work group is very different than that which you would implement if you were a terrorist cell, right? In a terrorist cell, you don't want many connections. So if one guy's arrested, he can't degrade the whole thing. So, the network structure if you were Osama bin Laden and you wanted to optimize the structure of your network, it's going to be different than if you are, Bill Gates and you're trying to optimize the structure of your teams at Microsoft. But what I can tell you, just as you are arguing, is that these things do matter for organizations, how they learn, how they work together, and so on. We have done some work that shows that, at least for the typical organization, we've looked at, for example, network structure. There's something known as transitivity, which is the probability that your friends are friends with each other. And it turns out that very low transitivity, where none of your friends are friends with each other, is bad for productivity. And that's because you and your friends aren't friends with each other. You can't work together to achieve some objective. But conversely, at the other extreme, very high transitivity is bad because if all your friends are friends with each other, you're a little tight-knit group. You're not open to innovation and new ideas. You're kind of isolated in a little silo. So the optimal organizational performance is with middling level of transitivity. This is a network property. A lot of this work was done by Brian Utsi at the Kellogg School. You may know his work. So I guess the way I would answer your question is to say that there is no universal prescription for optimizing performance in all organizations, but it is the case that these insights are useful to managers in figuring out what might happen, what works best in their organizations. I'll give you one more example. Many years ago, about 10 years ago, we were contacted by a industrial firm in the United States that had 56 factories in the United States and had very different accident rates. And they seemed to have similar training programs. They recruited similar workers. But some of their factories, people were getting their hands cut off all the time, and in other factories, they didn't have these problems. And so their question to us was, well, why? Why? What is it about? We don't see anything. That the human capital is the same at every place. What could explain it? And we had some ideas about how the social capital might be different. How the network structure and the patterns of communication and learning that were taking place among the workers were different. And we made some recommendations to them about how to map the networks at their firms. And we did some pilot work with them, which they abandoned the project. But we did some pilot work with them where we looked at the structure of social interactions in the different factories. And there was some hint that the factories that had higher accident rates had fewer ties of certain kinds in the thing. So that's just one example. I didn't do as good a job with your question as I would have liked, but that's my best shot.
Thank you. Jan Willem.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. That was really very interesting. I have two questions that more or less mirror the earlier questions by Dietrich. So I'll start with the simple one, and then if there's time, I'll get to the more general. The simple one is about your experiments where you introduce the bots and you show that they have a positive effect socially. I was just wondering if you also made the comparison of doing the same thing, not with bots, but with humans. Is that part of your experiments?
Yes.
Because what seems to be happening there is just you could call it social nudging. So yes, you're nudging people in a social way. So do you actually have the experiment? And is there a difference between doing this through a human or through a bot?
Yeah. Those are great questions, and it opens up lots of things to answer. And the answer is the good news is I can answer these questions. The bad news is it could take a whole hour additional lecture to give the full response. But the gist is many times we get ideas for what kinds of bots programming to implement by studying functional human groups. So for example, in a paper we published in Nature in 2017 on coordination, using the graph coloring problem, what we first did is we just observed groups of people trying to work together to solve the graph coloring problem. And we found, oh my God, these groups are working well. Well, why are they working well? Well, there's some people in the group that are very flexible, that have a little noisiness in their behavior. Why don't we program bots to do that and see if we add it to other groups of people, it'll work. So we model oftentimes the behavior of the bots on effective humans, first point. Sometimes, second point, we come up with crazy ideas of our own, without, let's say, observational work, and we try those and we see if they work, and sometimes they also work, second point. Third point we've done experiments where we have decrypted whether, so we create these human groups, and then we usually surreptitiously replace some of the people with bots, and then see if that group performs differently. But sometimes we've done experiments where we do everything the same, except we disencrypt whether it's a bot or not. In other words, we say to the people, you're in a group, there's some humans and some bots, you can't tell the difference. Or we have the same experimental, but now we say, actually, we're going to identify who the bots are. And we find in general that that doesn't affect the performance of the human teams. In other words, people, the general rule we have concluded, we've done this 2 or 3 times, is that people generally don't mind having bots in their midst, provided the bots are acting beneficently and the people believe the bots are acting beneficently. In other words, if you think, oh, I'm in a group of 20 people and there's one bot and it's here to help us and it is helping us, you don't care. If on the other hand, the bot's there to harm you, you get very angry at the bot. And by the way, this is a little bit of a tangential idea. I'm having sort of flight of ideas right now. The attitudes that we have towards delicts by machines versus humans is very different, right? So if you think about, let's say you are at a diner and you order coffee and the waitress brings you the wrong coffee. You might be mildly upset or disappointed by that. But you certainly wouldn't kick the waitress, right? That would be regarded as absurd to do that. Now imagine, on the other hand, a vending machine makes the same mistake and dispenses the wrong coffee. If you kick the vending machine, we wouldn't think so bad of you, right? In fact, many of you probably have kicked vending machines in your lives, and you're not bad people. But none of you have probably ever kicked a waiter in your life. And you also might be angrier at the machine than you would be at the human, because you have different expectations about perfection in the machine than you do with a human, and more empathy with a human than you would, let's say, with a machine. So all of these dynamics are at play in these systems, and we've done some experiments. By the way, we're not the only group doing experiments like that. And I think I just saw that Alex is on this on the call as well. I don't see his photo. Did he came in? Alex Masudi is on this call. His group has done some extraordinary experiments of a similar kind about social learning. Although anyway, and Iyad Rawan's group at the Max Planck in Berlin has been doing a lot of work on human-machine systems. What was your second question, John?
I'll leave that because Marion also has her hand up, so I'll turn it back to Jeff. Thank you. That was very useful.
I'm happy to correspond by email if you want, and possibly your questions addressed in the book as well.
Thank you both. Marion. Marion, you need to unmute. You need to unmute. You're muted. You need to unmute.
There you go, Marion. I see you now.
Is that unmuted now? Okay.
Yes, it is.
Thank you for a great book. It's been quite a few years since I read it. So, and you touched on some of the things here now and some others you didn't. But I don't remember in your book you're mentioning or talking about the relationship between genes and culture, and you mentioned it here briefly. I was going to say there's been a fair amount of thinking. I did a paper a long time ago about that. It really depends upon what direction the culture is transmitted. If it's transmitted vertically between parents and offspring or closely related kins, they tend to evolve to match genes and culture. But if it's transmitted obliquely, both are favored to unmatch. And if it's transferred horizontally, one could be favored to match and the other one to unmatch. So it really depends very much on how culture is transmitted relative to the genetic.
So I have a chapter in the book on gene culture or coevolution, or sections of a chapter. And what I'm trying to do right now, and I don't know if I'll be able to do it fast enough, is find a searchable version of my book to see if I cite your work.
Oh, I can't remember whether it was done before or after I read your book.
Yes, but that's a very good set of ideas that I'm going to think more about. The the issue of vertical versus oblique transmission and how that plays out.
Horizontal. There's 3.
Yeah.
No, it's a great book and a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Alex Masudi has just apologized that his mic and camera are not working, but he's thanked you for your talk. So on his behalf, I mentioned that. I think probably it's a good time to bring this very, very interesting discussion to an end. I'm extremely stimulated, Nicholas, by your talk. I think everybody else is here too. Raises a number of questions, very promising lines of inquiry. And we look forward to seeing more of your work. But first of all, thank you very much indeed for coming to talk to us.
Thank you guys for having me, and thank you for all the work that you do. I'm familiar with some of you, not all of you, but if you send me the list of people's names, I'm going to do a little Googling and see who I was speaking to. I'd be grateful.
Great. Well, thanks again.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.